What's up, 7th graders? Welcome back to my kitchen. Hope that you're doing well. And today I wanted to make a new video, building on what we talked about last week. Remember last week the video was about a review of percents and also talking about how can we use and find percents to make sure that we're better understanding what we're seeing happening right now around the country, and specifically in our city, due to coronavirus. And so we talked about which groups of people are getting sick, which groups of people aren't getting sick, and then how that impacted last week's election. So if you didn't see that video, make sure that you circle back, take a look at that video, quickly review how to use and find percents. And then today I wanted to dive further in and talk about how can you analyze any type of math, any number, specifically percents though, to make sure that you fully understand when people are trying to tell you a story or convince you of something specifically related to coronavirus. Because all the time people try to use numbers and math to lie to you and tell you a certain story that might not be telling the complete truth. And so today, let's take a look. Here's an example of a post or a headline that you might read someplace about coronavirus. It says the number of deaths from COVID-19 in Milwaukee County is only 0.01% of the population. So that seems like a really small number. And here are the actual numbers. In Milwaukee, as of today, April 16th, 103 people have died from coronavirus. And across the country, across the entire United States, 25,871 people have died from coronavirus. Now, if we really want to understand, is this a lie? You might be starting to think about, based on these numbers, you might be able to start considering how this statement up here is a little deceiving. And it might be a complete lie. There's two different types of lies. Sometimes people can lie to you by just telling you something that's completely false. And then sometimes people might tell you something that is a fact, but they are using that fact in a way that's deceiving and skewing and building this different story. And so that's sort of what this statement is right here. And since you have an understanding of how to compare percents and fractions and decimals, you can walk through and analyze, how is this a lie? And how does this not tell the entire story? So to begin, we can start thinking about this number right here, 0.01%. Well, as we reviewed last week, we know that whenever we're talking about a percent is talking about how much of a part out of a total of 100%. So we could rewrite this number as 0.01 out of 100. Okay, now that seems really minuscule. That's tiny, and that's hard for me to understand because this doesn't make sense, having a decimal on top of a fraction. So what we can do is, as you all know, we could change this by multiplying both the numerator and the denominator by a form of 1. So if we multiplied both the numerator and the denominator by 100, then we would get 1 out of 10,000. Okay, that's making more sense because now we know that out of every 10,000 people in Milwaukee, one person has died from coronavirus. We can also think about that in terms of a fraction. We could take that percent and say that's the same as 0.001. All right, that's pretty small. That's saying if we were talking about it in terms of money, you would need 100 of these to get 1 penny. Okay, that's pretty small. But if we're thinking about how right now, that's how many people have died in Milwaukee, but we could compare ourselves to cities like Seattle and New York, who had more people getting sick and dying before we did. And so they're seeing even more people getting sick. And so Milwaukee might be moving that same direction. We could also compare ourselves to other countries like China and Italy, who also had people breaking out with the coronavirus a lot earlier than we did. And, right now they see their total number of cases and deaths going down because they're able to control the spread of the virus. But unfortunately in the United States, numbers are still on the rise. And so we might see ourselves getting to that point. Still though, 1 out of every 10,000 people might not seem like a big number. But if we're talking about humans, like people, those are people who are dying, and we don't need, even if it's that small of a number, we don't need that many people dying from something that could have been completely prevented, right? All right, now let's think about, hopefully the numbers don't continue to go up, but they might. And I don't want to spend too much time thinking about how the number of cases could increase. But I think it's important because we want to figure out how can we compare such a small number. It's way less than 1% of something. So what if we said that a little later on, as the numbers continue to rise, people might still try to tell you a story, tell you a lie based on how small the number might still be. It might still be less than 1%, but we can figure out how much bigger actually is it. So let's say someone's trying to lie to you and someone's trying to say, no, the number's still really small, only 0.1%. As the numbers rise, they might use a fraction to start talking about how many people have died. What if they say that now 0.1% of people, of the total population of Milwaukee, has died from coronavirus? Well, you could start to figure out that's still really small. That's still way less than 1. Just like this was less than 1, this is still way less than 1. It's still a tiny number. But how much bigger is it actually? We're going to have to do the math and walk through to be able to explain to that person why that's a lie, why that's not telling the full truth. All right, so to do that, we can again say that 0.1% is the same as saying that we have 1/10 over 100. Remember, percent means out of 100. Now this is messy. This doesn't make any sense to me. So what I can do is see how we're dividing this by 100. To figure that out and figure out what it is in a bigger number, we can multiply it by the reciprocal. So instead of dividing by 100, we could take 1/10 and multiply that by the reciprocal, which is 1/100, okay? 1/10 times 1/100th is going to be equal to 1 out of 1,000. And right away, you can compare these two numbers. You can see that this one's a lot bigger than this number. But you might not understand that because that person who you're explaining to might not really understand fractions. So you say, okay, well, we can figure out that 1 out of 1,000, if we have 1 out of 1,000, we can use equivalent fractions. And if we multiply this to be equivalent to 10,000, well, if we multiply the denominator and the numerator by 10, then we get 10 out of 10,000. So now we're talking about originally, right now, 1 out of 10,000 people in Milwaukee have died from coronavirus. But what if that person tried to tell you another lie and say, no, it's still really small. Still only 0.1% of people in Milwaukee have died. Well, that's equivalent to 10 out of every 10,000 people have died. And even though this was only way smaller than 1%, and this was also way smaller than 1%, see how many times bigger this is? This is 10 times bigger. So now we could say if right now 103 people have died in Milwaukee from coronavirus. Now, how would that compare to if we said that all of a sudden 0.1% of people have died? Well, we would have to take 103, and if we're saying we're making it 10 times bigger, what's 10 times that number of deaths? 0. All of a sudden, we're talking about this many people in Milwaukee would have died from coronavirus. So what I really want you to understand is that when someone says it's less than 1%, that doesn't necessarily mean anything unless we're actually figuring out and comparing what that actual number is. Because this is less than 1%, this is also way less than 1%, but it has a huge difference. In the span of the next month, I hope not, but what we might see based on the number of tests that are coming in and the number of people who are acting irresponsible, we might go from 1 out of every 10,000 people in Milwaukee dying to maybe 10 out of every 10,000 people dying. Or we might go from right now 103 deaths in Milwaukee to all of a sudden 1,030 deaths in Milwaukee. So what I'm going to ask you to do is I'm going to ask you to pay attention. Any news articles that you're reading, any posts that you see online, in what ways are you seeing math being used in a way that skews the truth and not telling the full story?